This is an AQA Psychology A-Level revision video for the Paper 1 topic of attachments with a specific focus on Ainsworth strain situation, the types of attachment and the cultural variations from Van Huysendorn and Cronenberg. So looking at where that sits in the specification, that all three parts are part 1 bullet point. And so you've got Ainsworth strain situation, and that is the method of the strain situation, which you'll need to know in detail and be able to evaluate. The 3 types of attachment as named on the spec, and then the research into the cultural variations of those types of attachments. So getting started with Ainsworth. Ainsworth actually worked with Bowlby and his attachment theory, and she wanted to create a method to test the strength of attachments. So the method she created was called the strange situation. The strange situation was a controlled observation, and as I've mentioned, it was to measure the strength and the security of the attachment of a child and their caregiver. So her original sample was 100 middle-class American mothers alongside their infants that were aged between 12 to 18 months. She had a highly standardised observation procedure. It was in a lab in controlled conditions. She used the same size room, marked into 16 squares, so it's 9 by 9 feet. She had a mirror, a one-way or a two-way mirror, whichever you prefer to call it, in which she could covertly observe the behaviour without sort of interfering with the study. And she designed behavioural categories for the observation. So she broke down that attachment behaviour she was looking for into clear criteria, which we are about to look at. So she looked for proximity seeking, whether the infant was nearby their caregiver. She looked for, does the infant explore and do they return to their caregiver as a safe base every now and then, so a point of contact that they use. She also looked at stranger anxiety. Do they get upset when a stranger is nearby? Separation anxiety, do they cry when they're separated from the caregiver? And how do they respond on reunion? Do they accept comfort from the caregiver once the caregiver's left and returned? So the observation consisted of 8 different episodes, 8 different stages, and they are going to be on the screen now. A really good way to revise this is to sort of draw a storyboard or draw the sequences out just so you've got a visual aid there. But those are the 8 stages, and generally it's the child and a caregiver in an unfamiliar room, a stranger present or absent, and child left alone, and then observing the reunion behaviour when the caregiver returns. So that's it in a nutshell, but if you do want to aim for the higher grades, the A's, the A stars, then it is worthwhile knowing these 8 stages in the right order. So what Ainsworth found through that observation of 100 mothers and babies are 3 main types of attachment types. 66% of her sample had a secure attachment, which you might also see referred to as a type B. So the characteristics are here on the screen. You've got also 22% of the sample that had an insecure avoidant attachment, so type A, and then 12%, so the smallest number of Ainsworth sample were insecure resistant. So this is an opportunity to pause the video and note down, either using the screen or from memory, what the different attachment behaviours are for each attachment type, and in 5 seconds I'll go through the answers. Okay, so here you have a summary of the different attachment types, and the main thing you will see is if we look at these 2 columns between separation and stranger anxiety, secure will show distress and be wary of strangers. Insecure avoidance will have little response to separation anxiety and stranger anxiety. And then insecure resistant will be very distressed on stranger anxiety, hard to comfort when the caregiver returns, but will avoid the stranger. So that is the AO1 for Ainsworth strange situation. So you need to know the procedure, you need to know the findings and the main behaviours of the attachment types. We're now going to move on to evaluate Ainsworth and then explore the cultural variations of Ainsworth strange situation. So a piece of research, have a little read, see what this would suggest about Ainsworth's findings in terms of there being a secure, insecure avoidant, insecure resistant attachment type. In 5 seconds I'll go through the answers. Okay, so this suggests that Ainsworth has been simplistic. Her findings are limited because there are Other attachment types, for example, the type D, disorganized attachment type, which consists of a lack of consistent social patterns. So Ainsworth didn't actually consider that a child might not respond the same way all the time, and therefore they might not react the same way to separation anxiety. And so a simplistic look, a simplistic outlook, simplistic findings. On the screen are some other evaluation points that you can use, and the one I would recommend is that it's a culture-bound test, because actually in other cultures, for example in Japan, where mothers are rarely separated from their babies, often they carry them on their chest and go to work with them and that sort of thing, these children experience high levels of separation anxiety. And often when the strange situation was performed, the mothers would rush to the baby to scoop them up. So there wasn't actually a chance to observe how the baby would react to response on reunion. So cross-culturally, the strange situation as a method, it just doesn't work. But also the findings are quite ethnocentric in suggesting that secure attachment is the most ideal type, when actually in Japan, insecure resistant is more common and is more valued. The same can be said for Germany, but with insecure avoidant attachments. However, a good thing is that there is high inter-rater reliability. Strange situations are a very well-designed method under controlled conditions with the behavioural categories. And Bick et al. In 2012 used a team of trained strange situation observers, and they found agreement for 94%. And now, for something to have high reliability, you're looking at about 80%. So for that to be 94%, that's really, really good. And therefore, we can be confident the attachment type of an infant isn't just about who's observing them, because other observers also agree. And then lastly, attachment type as defined by the strange situation does link to Bowlby's internal working model. So babies assessed as secure do go on to have better outcomes in relationships, and that is something that has been found across the board in lots of different pieces of research. So this is evidence for the validity of her attachment types, because it can explain future outcomes. So that's the evaluation for Ainsworth, and that is Ainsworth covered in a nutshell. We're now moving on to the cultural variations by Van Eijendorn and Cronenberg. So they conducted a meta-analysis. So this is a piece of secondary research that they didn't carry out themselves, but they used other people's studies of the strange situation in different countries or cultures, as they claimed. And so we move on now to look at the procedure involved by Van Eijendorn and Cronenberg. So 32 studies of attachment. Strange situation was used in all 32 studies, conducted in 8 countries. 18 of them were in the USA, so over half of the studies were American, but a very large sample size of 1990 children. So hopefully with those numbers you can already think of some evaluation points, which we'll get into shortly, but let's just have a brief look at the results. Here you can sort of disregard this bit in terms of number of mother-infant pairs, because that's always weighted for and accounted for in terms of percentages. And what you want to look at here is the findings. So type A is insecure avoidant, type B is a secure attachment, and type C is insecure resistant. And looking at the patterns. I'm going to pause the video and give you an opportunity now to answer these 4 questions before I go through them in 5 seconds. Okay, so we can see the most popular attachment type is secure, type B, so that column has the highest percentages, but there is a higher percentage for insecure avoidant, certainly in Germany, as I have mentioned, so 35% compared to all other countries which are sort of in their 20s or below. And then insecure resistant is particularly high both in Japan and Israel. Israel actually has a slightly higher percentage, but there isn't much literature onto the reasons why, whereas for Japan there is. So we will focus on Japan and Germany as the 2 main cultural variations. So we conclude children from different cultures show different attachment styles because of the different cultural practices and what is the norm in terms of parenting in those countries. So secure attachment does seem to be the norm across the planet, if you like, especially from those 32 studies in 8 countries. which could support Bowlby's idea that attachment is innate, because if it is across the world, if it's a universal norm, then surely that must be biological. However, cultural practices definitely have an influence on attachment type. So that's the AO1 that you need for cultural variations. Let's move on now to consider some of these evaluation points. Opportunity to pause the video, 5 seconds, and then we will go through the points. Okay, so when we're talking about the method used, there was a culture-bound method used of the strain situation. Yes, the strain situation was really well created, but actually it doesn't translate. It's culture bound. It doesn't translate across the whole world. It was designed by US researchers for USA babies, so it's not necessarily valid to use in other countries. The sample sizes in studies were quite small. There was only one study used in Sweden, so it might not be valid to base a whole conclusion on cultural variations just on such small studies. But they did use a very large sample size of almost 2,000 children. However, again, 27 of the studies took place in individualistic cultures. That's like the UK, the USA. Remember, 18 of them were in the USA alone, and only 5 were in collectivist cultures like Japan, Israel. Furthermore, the study was about countries, not cultures. As you may have picked up on, I've often referred to them as countries. Just within Japan alone, there are variations within that country. So you would assume that the whole of Japan has the same culture, but that's not necessarily true. The same in the UK. We know the UK is made up of lots of different cultures with lots of different traditions and norms across those cultures. So if we take Japan, in the sort of rural parts of Japan, that is where we might find more insecure resistant attachment styles, but in the urban, actually, it's highly secure, and insecure resistant is less common. So it's countries, not cultures, that they have studied. And even in the study of the countries, they have ignored the differences amongst sort of within the country rather than between the countries. So that concludes the end of this video. Thank you for watching. I hope you found it useful.